I run the Willowbrook Community Center, which sounds more important than it actually is. Mostly I coordinate after-school programs and make sure the coffee machine works for the Senior Citizen Breakfast Club. Been doing it for 8 years now, ever since my divorce when I needed something that felt like helping people without the emotional mess of actual therapy work. My ex always said I was too involved in other people's business anyway. Maybe he was right, but at least here it's literally my job. The first time I heard the chains, I was locking up after the Tuesday night book club. Mystery lovers, though half of them just come for Freya Todd's homemade cookies and to complain about their grandchildren. It was around 9:15. October, getting that bite where you can smell winter coming even though the leaves are still mostly green on the maples lining Elm Street. The sound came from somewhere north of the center, maybe toward the old craftsman houses where the property values started climbing before the recession hit. Clink, drag, clink. Metal on pavement, rhythmic but wrong somehow. Not like a dog chain or a kid dragging a bike chain, though that's what I told myself walking to my Honda, the reliable one, not the Subaru that died last spring because I kept putting off the transmission repair. Probably someone moving furniture, I said out loud, because I talk to myself when I'm nervous. Bad habit from living alone too long. The sound stopped when my car door slammed. Wednesday morning brought Kieran Bliss to my office, which was unusual because Kieran worked nights at the hospital and usually slept until 2. He's been using our meeting room for his sleep disorder support group since last year. Nice guy, too thin, always looks like he hasn't slept properly even though that's literally his medical condition. Nadia, you hear anything weird last night? He slumped in the folding chair across from my desk, the one with the loose screw I keep meaning to fix. Like chains? Metal dragging on concrete. My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. You heard it too? Around 9:30, maybe 9:45. I was walking home from work, cutting through the park. He rubbed his eyes, leaving red marks on his pale skin. Thought maybe it was construction equipment, but who does road work at night in a residential area? Where exactly did you hear it? Started near the community garden, then moved north toward Maple Street. Followed the sound for maybe 2 blocks before it just stopped. Kieran's hands twisted in his lap. This is going to sound crazy, but I kept walking in that direction anyway. Felt like I had to, you know? Like when you hear a smoke alarm beeping in another apartment and you can't ignore it. I knew that feeling. The same compulsion had made me take the long way home last night, driving slowly through the neighborhood streets even though I should have been tired. Find anything? Nothing. But here's the thing. I walked past the Dunkin' on Maple, and Chloe Dunn was working the late shift. She heard it too. Said it woke up half the customers who were trying to catch some sleep before their early shifts. Chloe was reliable. Worked 2 jobs to support her kid since her boyfriend split. Not someone who made things up or got spooked easily. We should ask around, I said, already reaching for my phone. If multiple people heard it. I already did. Called my neighbor Jude Lane this morning. He's got insomnia worse than mine. Stays up until 3 most nights reading or playing guitar with headphones. Kieran leaned forward. He heard it too, Nadia. Said it lasted maybe 20 minutes, moving in a pattern. Like someone walking patrol. The community center phone rang, our main line that mostly gets calls about room rentals and lost and found items. I almost let it go to voicemail. Willowbrook Community Center, Nadia speaking. Oh, thank God. Someone who might actually listen. The voice was elderly, female, trembling with either age or fear. This is Mrs. Chun from Oak Street. I need to report something, but the police think I'm just some confused old lady. Mrs. Chun lived alone in one of the smaller houses near the park. Had been coming to our senior programs since before I started working here. Sharp as anyone, despite what her daughter thought. What can I help you with, Mrs. Chun? The chains. You've heard them, haven't you? That awful dragging sound. Kieran was watching me now, sitting up straighter. When did you hear this, Mrs. Chun? Last 3 nights running. always between 9 and 10:30, always moving through the neighborhood in the same pattern. Starts near the park, goes north to Maple, then east toward the elementary school, then back south toward downtown. Her voice cracked. I've lived here 47 years. I know every sound this neighborhood makes. This isn't normal construction or some kid playing pranks. Have you seen anything besides hearing the sound? That's just it. There's nothing to see. No person, no equipment, no animal. Just the sound moving along the streets like something invisible dragging chains behind it. After Mrs. Chun hung up, promising to call me if she heard it again, Kieran and I sat in silence for maybe 30 seconds. Outside, I could hear the regular sounds of Willowbrook morning routine. School buses, car doors, someone's dog barking at the mailman. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. So what do we do? Kieran asked. We figure out what's making the noise, I said, though part of me already knew it wouldn't be that simple. Can you stay awake tonight? Meet me here around 8:45. Yeah, but Nadia, what if we don't like what we find? Then at least we'll know. I was already making mental notes about who else to call. The community center existed to serve the neighborhood, and if something was disturbing people's sleep and peace of mind, that made it my responsibility. Bring a flashlight, and maybe ask Jude if he wants to come. After Kieran left, I tried to focus on regular work, reviewing the budget for next month's Halloween party, returning emails about the yoga class schedule, calling the repair company about the broken heating unit in the back room. But every few minutes, I'd catch myself listening for sounds outside, sounds that didn't belong. The afternoon brought Silas Hart to my office, which surprised me because Silas usually only came around when he needed the community meeting room for his neighborhood watch meetings. He was the kind of guy who took local civic responsibility seriously, too seriously according to some people, but he got things done. Nadia, I've been hearing reports about some kind of disturbance in the area. Noise complaints, people feeling unsafe walking at night. Silas settled into the visitor chair like he was preparing for a long conversation. Figured you might know something since you've got your finger on the pulse of community concerns. What kind of reports? Chain sounds, metal dragging, moving through the residential area in a pattern. He pulled out a small notebook, the kind cops use on TV shows. I've mapped out the sightings based on 4 separate witness accounts. Want to see? The map he showed me covered a 6-block area of central Willowbrook, with red lines marking the route Mrs. Chun had described to me. Starting points near the park, movement patterns following the main residential streets, timestamps all falling between 9 p.m. and 10:30. This is good work, Silas. Very thorough. It's what I do. He closed the notebook. But here's what concerns me. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, been running the watch program for 8. I know the difference between normal community issues and something that needs serious attention. You think this is serious? I think 4 separate witnesses reporting the same anomaly in the same area following the same pattern over consecutive nights suggests something worth investigating. Could be vandalism, could be someone casing houses, could be... He paused. Could be something else. Something else. You ever hear about the Chain Walker legend? Old story from when this area was first developed, back in the 30s. I hadn't, but something cold settled in my stomach anyway. Local folklore says there was a man who used to patrol these streets at night during the Depression, dragging chains behind him to scare away vagrants and troublemakers. Neighborhood hired him unofficially, vigilante work, basically. Story goes he took the job too seriously, started threatening residents too, anyone he thought didn't belong. Silas leaned back. One night, residents got tired of his harassment, ran him out of town, but not before he promised to keep walking these streets until the neighborhood learned proper respect for order. That's just a story, though. Probably. But stories don't usually create identical witness reports following predictable patterns. He stood up. I'm organizing a community meeting for tomorrow night. Think you could help spread the word through your programs here?" After Silas left, I found myself staring out the window at Elm Street, watching the normal afternoon foot traffic. Kids walking home from school, joggers, dog walkers, mail delivery. Everything looked exactly like it always did. But I kept listening for chain sounds anyway. By Thursday evening, I talked to 11 different people who'd heard the chains. Not all of them were willing to admit it at first. Took some coaxing to get past the probably nothing and didn't want to sound crazy responses. But once they started talking, the details were remarkably consistent. 9 p.m. to 10:30, same route through the neighborhood. Metal on pavement dragging sound, rhythmic but irregular, like someone walking with a limp while pulling something heavy. Always moving, never stationary. Always invisible. Kieran met me outside the community center at 8:45, carrying a thermos of coffee and a flashlight that looked like it belonged in a police cruiser. Jude Lane was with him, tall, quiet guy who worked tech support from home and knew every piece of electronic equipment in the neighborhood because he'd fixed most of it. "Brought a digital recorder," Jude said, holding up a small device. "If we're going to document this thing, we should do it properly." Silas arrived at 9 sharp with a notebook, a watch that could probably survive nuclear war, and Chloe Dunn from the Duncan. Chloe looked tired but determined, the way she always looked when dealing with difficult customers or malfunctioning coffee machines. "My manager gave me the night off," she explained. "Figured if something's disturbing the neighborhood, I want to know what it is. I walk home through this area every night after work." We positioned ourselves in the park, near the community garden where multiple witnesses had reported the sound starting. The October night was clear but cold, moon bright enough to make flashlights almost unnecessary. Normal sounds surrounded us. Traffic from the main road, someone's TV through an open window, a cat yowling 2 blocks away. At 9:12, we heard it. Clink, drag, clink. The sound came from the north end of the park, near the playground equipment. Distant but unmistakable, metal chain dragging across pavement, moving steadily but not quite rhythmically, like someone walking with an uneven gait. "Everyone getting this?" Jude whispered, holding up his recorder. We followed the sound north along Oak Street, staying about half a block behind. Not close enough to see what was making it because there was nothing to see, but close enough to track the movement. The dragging noise moved at walking pace, pausing occasionally before continuing. "It's following the sidewalk," Silas noted, consulting his map with a small penlight. "Staying on the pedestrian route, not cutting through yards or taking shortcuts." "Like someone who knows the neighborhood," Kieran said. At the intersection of Oak and Maple, the sound turned east, just as Mrs. Chun had described. We followed, keeping our distance, a small group of neighbors trailing an invisible something through streets we'd all walked countless times. The weird part wasn't just that we couldn't see what was making the noise. The weird part was how the neighborhood was reacting to it. Dogs that should have been barking at an unusual sound were quiet. Motion sensor lights that should have been triggering as the sound pass stayed dark. Even the automatic sprinkler system at the corner house, which I knew went off at 9:30 every night, didn't activate. "It's like the neighborhood doesn't recognize it," Chloe said quietly. "Like whatever's making that sound doesn't register as really being here." We followed the pattern for 40 minutes, watching the sound move through residential streets in what was clearly a patrol route. When it finally stopped, somewhere near the elementary school, fading gradually rather than cutting off suddenly, we found ourselves standing on Morrison Avenue, 5 neighbors who'd just spent the evening chasing a noise. "Did anyone else feel like we were being watched?" Jude asked as we walked back toward the community center. Everyone nodded. "Not by whatever was making the chains," Kieran added. "By something else. Like we were the ones being followed." Friday morning brought 3 more calls to the community center from residents who'd heard the chains Thursday night. 2 more from people asking about Silas's community meeting. 1 from Mrs. Chun saying she'd started sleeping with her bedroom lights on. That afternoon, I decided to do some research. The Willowbrook Library kept local history archives, and Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had been collecting neighborhood stories since before I was born. The chain walker? Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows went up when I asked. Haven't heard anyone mention that story in years. Nasty bit of local folklore. She led me to the basement archives, past boxes of old newspapers and school yearbooks, to a file cabinet marked Local Legends and Oral History Projects. Here we go. This is from a WPA project in 1938, interviewing longtime residents about neighborhood history. She pulled out a manila folder thick with typed pages. The chain walker stories come from the Depression era, like Silas mentioned, but they're darker than the usual folklore. I read while Mrs. Patterson made copies for me to take home. According to the interviews, the chain walker had been hired by a group of property owners in 1934 to discourage undesirables from settling in the area. His methods had started with intimidation, walking patrol at night, dragging chains to make noise and establish presence. But over time, the intimidation became harassment, then violence. Residents complained to police multiple times about a man who threatened anyone he considered suspicious, which included renters, single women, immigrants, anyone who didn't fit his idea of proper neighborhood material. One interview read, "He carried heavy chains wrapped around his arms and claimed authority to enforce community standards that no one had officially given him." The story ended badly. In October 1935, exactly 90 years ago, a group of residents confronted the chain walker during one of his patrols. The confrontation turned violent. The man was severely beaten and left unconscious near the park. He died 3 days later from his injuries. No one was ever charged. According to the interviews, residents reported hearing chain sounds for months afterward, always following the same route the man had patrolled in life. The sounds gradually faded, but every few years, usually in October, someone would report hearing them again. The interesting thing, Mrs. Patterson said when I finished reading, is that the reports never came from new residents, only from families who'd lived here during the original incidents, or their children who'd grown up hearing the stories. Like it only appeared to people who knew about it, or people it considered legitimate neighborhood residents. She paused. The interviews suggest the chain walker was very particular about who belonged in the area. I left the library with copies of the historical documents and a growing certainty that we were dealing with something beyond normal community problem solving. But I also left with a clearer understanding of why the sound was returning now, following the same pattern, during the same month as the original incidents. The question was, what did it want? Friday evening's community meeting filled the main room at the center beyond capacity. Word had spread through the neighborhood faster than I'd expected. Social media, next-door apps, phone calls, conversations over fences and at the grocery store. 43 people showed up, including families I'd never seen at community events. Silas ran the meeting with his usual thoroughness, presenting witness accounts and mapping the chain walker's route. Jude played his audio recording, though the chains were barely audible over background noise. Several residents shared their own experiences from the past week. The mood was tense but practical. These were people who'd chosen to live in an established neighborhood because they valued stability and security. Whatever was disturbing that stability needed to be addressed. "So what are our options?" asked Mr. Rodriguez, who'd lived on Oak Street for 20 years and served on the Homeowners Association board. "We could contact police," suggested someone in the back. "About a noise complaint with no visible source?" Silas shook his head. "They'll file a report and forget about it." "What about ignoring it?" This from a younger woman I didn't recognize. "If it's just sound, no actual threat, maybe it'll go away on its own." Mrs. Chun stood up slowly from her seat in the front row. I've been ignoring things in this neighborhood for 47 years. Ignored the vandalism that turned into break-ins. Ignored the speeding that turned into accidents. Ignored the noise complaints that turned into actual disturbances. Her voice was steady but firm. This isn't going away. It's getting stronger, more consistent. Every night this week, the sound has lasted longer and covered more area. So what do you suggest? Mr. Rodriguez asked. We find out what it wants, Mrs. Chen said, and we deal with it ourselves as a community. After the meeting, Mrs. Chen approached me while I was stacking chairs and turning off lights. Most people had left quickly, but a core group lingered: Kieran, Jude, Chloe, Silas, and a few others who'd been taking notes and asking detailed questions. Nadia, I need to tell you something I didn't want to share with the whole group, Mrs. Chen said quietly. The chains aren't just making noise anymore. They're affecting the neighborhood in other ways. What do you mean? My neighbor's dog disappeared 2 nights ago, just vanished from a fenced yard. The Hartman's motion lights have been malfunctioning all week. The automatic systems on Elm Street, irrigation, security, even some of the newer cars, they're all acting strange. She paused. And I think the chain walker is getting more selective about who hears it. Selective how? The families who moved in during the last 5 years? Most of them aren't reporting the sound at all. It's primarily longtime residents, people whose families have been here for decades. Silas overheard and joined our conversation. That matches the historical pattern. The original incidents targeted people the chain walker considered outsiders, but the supernatural activity afterward only affected established families. You think it's trying to enforce some kind of neighborhood standard? I asked. I think it's deciding who belongs here and who doesn't, Mrs. Chen said. And I think we need to figure out its criteria before it moves beyond making noise. Chloe looked up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through social media. Check the Willowbrook neighborhood Facebook page. 3 families have posted about feeling unwelcome this week. All of them moved in recently. All of them live along the chain walker's route. She showed us the posts. Nothing dramatic. Complaints about unfriendly neighbors, feeling like they didn't fit in, questions about whether they'd made a mistake buying in this area. But all posted within the last few days, all from residents who lived in houses the chain walker passed during its nightly patrols. It's influencing people's perceptions, Jude said, creating an atmosphere of exclusion, or revealing attitudes that were already there, Silas countered. Maybe the chain walker isn't creating division. Maybe it's amplifying existing tensions about community standards and who gets to set them. Over the weekend, I visited every family that had reported hearing chains, asking questions about their history in the neighborhood, their connections to longtime residents, their sense of belonging in the community. The pattern Mrs. Chen had identified held true. The chain walker was primarily manifesting for people whose families had been in Willowbrook for at least a generation. But it wasn't just about length of residence. The families who heard the chains were also the families most involved in community activities, most invested in neighborhood standards, most vocal about maintaining property values and local character. People like me, who'd chosen service work specifically to be integrated into community life. People like Silas, whose neighborhood watch activities made him a guardian of local order. People like Mrs. Chen, whose 47 years of residence gave her authority to speak for neighborhood traditions. The chain walker was manifesting for people it recognized as legitimate community stakeholders, people with the right to enforce neighborhood standards. And that realization made me deeply uncomfortable. Sunday evening, I was at home reviewing my notes when my phone rang. Kieran, sounding more alert than I'd heard him in weeks. Nadia, you need to get down here. The chains are doing something different tonight. Different how? They're not following the usual route. They're stationary, positioned at specific houses, and people are gathering. I could hear voices in the background, multiple conversations overlapping. "Where are you?" "Oak Street, near the park. There are maybe 20 people here, all just standing around listening to chains that aren't moving. It's like we're all waiting for instructions." I grabbed my jacket and drove to Oak Street, finding exactly what Kieran had described. A loose crowd of neighbors standing in small groups, all facing toward sounds I could hear clearly now. Chains dragging slowly back and forth across pavement, but staying in one location instead of moving in the usual patrol pattern. The sound was coming from in front of 847 Oak Street, a small blue house with an overgrown yard and newspapers piling up on the front porch. "That's the Morrison family," Mrs. Chun told me when I joined her near the sidewalk. "Moved in 6 months ago from California. Keep to themselves, don't participate in neighborhood activities. Different lifestyle than most of us." "Different how?" "Loud music at strange hours. Multiple cars coming and going. Yard maintenance that doesn't meet community standards." She gestured toward the house. "Property values in this area depend on everyone maintaining certain expectations." Silas was taking notes again, documenting who was present, what time the stationary chain sounds had started, the specific location. His notebook was thick with observations now, a detailed record of supernatural activity that felt increasingly like evidence for something I didn't want to acknowledge. "What do you think it wants us to do?" Chloe asked quietly. No one answered, but the implications hung heavy in the October air. The chain walker had gathered its recognized community stakeholders and positioned them in front of a house occupied by people who didn't fit neighborhood standards. Like some kind of supernatural homeowners association enforcement action. "Maybe we should talk to them," I suggested. "The Morrison family. Explain what's been happening. See if they've noticed anything unusual." "You think they can hear the chains?" Jude asked. Mrs. Chun shook her head. "New residents never hear them. That's part of the pattern. So they have no idea why 20 of their neighbors are standing in front of their house at 9 p.m. on a Sunday night," Kieran said. I looked around at the group of people I'd organized, people I'd encouraged to investigate this phenomenon, people who trusted my judgment about community issues. Responsible neighbors, invested stakeholders, people who cared about maintaining the area's character and values. People who were now participating in some kind of supernatural harassment of a family that didn't fit the established pattern. The chains continued their back and forth dragging sound, hypnotic and insistent. Around me, neighbors continued their quiet conversations about property maintenance and community standards and the importance of everyone doing their part to preserve neighborhood quality. And I realized the chain walker wasn't just enforcing its own ideas about who belonged in Willowbrook. It was using the legitimate concerns and investments of longtime residents to continue its original mission of intimidating people it considered undesirable. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I stepped away from the group and walked toward 847 Oak Street, leaving behind the quiet conversations about property standards and community expectations. The chain's sound grew louder as I approached the house, but also more urgent, like a warning. "Nadia, what are you doing?" Silas called after me. "What I should have done days ago," I said without turning around. "Checking on the people who live here instead of standing in their front yard having a neighborhood watch meeting." The Morrison family's porch light was on, and I could see someone moving behind the front window's curtains. When I knocked, the door opened to reveal a woman about my age with tired eyes and defensive posture. "Mrs. Morrison? I'm Nadia Pike from the community center. I wanted to apologize for the crowd outside your house and explain what's been happening in the neighborhood this week." She looked past me toward the group of neighbors still clustered near the sidewalk. "Are you here to complain about our yard too? Because we're doing the best we can with work schedules and—" "No complaints, just information." I kept my voice calm, the same tone I used with upset parents during school events. "We've been tracking some unusual activity in the area, and it's affecting several families. I wanted to make sure you knew what was going on and that you felt safe in your home." Mrs. Morrison's defensiveness softened slightly. Unusual activity? Behind her, I could hear a television and children's voices. Normal family evening sounds that should have been reassuring but somehow emphasized how isolated this family was from the community gathering in front of their house. There have been reports of strange noises at night, and some residents have been feeling unsettled. We're trying to figure out what's causing it and how to address the situation. I paused. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Sounds, disturbances, anything that made you feel uncomfortable?" "Just the neighbors," she said quietly. "People walking by slowly, staring at our house. Cars driving past multiple times per day. Feels like we're being watched, evaluated." She gestured toward her yard. "I know our lawn isn't perfect. We both work double shifts, and the kids have after-school activities. Sometimes yard work gets pushed to weekends. That's completely understandable. Most families struggle with, but apparently not in this neighborhood." There was exhaustion in her voice, the weariness of someone who'd been trying to meet standards they couldn't quite identify or achieve. "We moved here because the schools were good and the area seemed family-friendly. Turns out friendly has conditions we weren't told about." The chain sound stopped suddenly, leaving an odd silence that made both of us look toward the street. The group of neighbors was still there, but they'd moved closer to the house, standing in the front yard now instead of on the sidewalk. Mrs. Morrison stepped back instinctively. "What do they want?" "I think they want you to leave," I said honestly, because she deserved to know what she was dealing with. Not consciously, maybe not even deliberately, but there's something in this neighborhood that encourages conformity. And it's using people's legitimate concerns about community standards to pressure families who don't fit the established pattern. Something I could have explained about the chain walker legend, the historical incidents, the supernatural harassment that appeared every October. But looking at Mrs. Morrison's tired face and hearing her children's voices in the background, I realized the supernatural elements were less important than the human choice being demanded right now. "There's pressure to maintain certain community standards," I said instead. "Property maintenance, lifestyle choices, participation in neighborhood activities. Some residents take that pressure very seriously. And if we don't conform?" Before I could answer, Silas appeared at my shoulder. "Nadia, we need you back with the group. The situation is developing, and community stakeholders should present a unified response." Unified response to what? To the Morrison family's impact on neighborhood stability. His voice was reasonable, measured, the same tone he used during homeowners association meetings. Property values, community standards, shared expectations about civic participation. These aren't unreasonable concerns. Mrs. Morrison was backing farther into her house now, one hand on the door frame. "I think you should all leave our property." "Mrs. Morrison, no one wants to force you out," Silas continued. "But community membership comes with responsibilities. Yard maintenance, noise considerations, participation in neighborhood activities. Integration, not isolation." "Silas," I said quietly, "you're scaring her." "I'm explaining community expectations, the same expectations that apply to every resident." He was still using his reasonable voice, but there was something else underneath it now. Something that sounded like the chain walker's rhythm. Insistent, hypnotic, certain of its authority. "What if she can't meet those expectations?" I asked. "What if her family's work schedule doesn't allow for perfect yard maintenance? What if their kids' activities don't align with neighborhood social events? What if they're just trying to live their lives without bothering anyone? Then maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for them." The words hung in the air between us, reasonable and terrible. Behind Silas, I could see the other neighbors nodding agreement, their faces reflecting the same certainty about community standards and proper belonging. And I could see Mrs. Morrison realizing that 20 of her neighbors had gathered in front of her house on a Sunday evening to deliver that message. "You need to leave," I told Silas firmly. "All of you. This family hasn't done anything wrong, and they don't deserve to be intimidated in their own home." "Nadia, you're being emotional about this. Community standards exist for everyone's benefit." "No, Silas. You're being manipulated by something that's using your legitimate concerns about the neighborhood to harass a family that doesn't fit your idea of proper residence." I turned to face the group of neighbors, people I'd known and worked with for years. "This isn't community building. This is exclusion. This is exactly what happened here 90 years ago, and it ended badly then too." Kieran stepped forward from the group. "Nadia's right. This feels wrong. We came out here to investigate strange sounds, not to pressure anyone about their yard maintenance." "The two issues are connected," Mrs. Chun said, but her voice had less certainty than usual. "Community standards are being used to justify supernatural harassment," I finished. "The chain walker isn't protecting the neighborhood. It's continuing its original mission of intimidating people it considers undesirable, and it's using us to do it." The chain started up again, louder now, more agitated, back and forth, dragging with increasing urgency, like something pacing in frustration. "It's upset," Chloe said, looking around nervously. "Whatever's making that sound, it doesn't like what you're saying." "Good. It should be upset." I turned back to Mrs. Morrison, who was still standing in her doorway with her hand on the door frame. "I'm sorry this happened. These are good people being influenced by something that doesn't belong in this neighborhood. You and your family have every right to live here peacefully." "But do we?" Mrs. Morrison asked quietly. "Because it feels like we don't. It feels like there are rules no one told us about, standards we can't meet, expectations that change depending on who's making them." She looked past me toward the neighbors. "Maybe it would be easier to move somewhere else." "Maybe it would be easier," I agreed. "But easy isn't the same as right. And you shouldn't have to move because other people can't mind their own business." The chain sounds intensified, metal on pavement now mixed with what sounded like metal on metal, chains rattling with agitation. Around us, the neighbors were shifting uncomfortably, looking between me and the source of the noise. "Nadia," Jude said nervously, "I think we should listen to what it's trying to tell us. It's trying to tell us to enforce community standards through intimidation and exclusion. That's what it's always done." I stepped off the Morrison family's porch and faced the group. "And we can choose not to participate." But as I looked at the faces of people I'd known for years, Kieran with his sleep-deprived anxiety, Chloe with her exhaustion from working 2 jobs, Mrs. Chun with her 47 years of community investment, Silas with his genuine concern for neighborhood stability, I realized the choice wasn't as simple as I'd made it sound. These were people who cared about the community, who'd invested time and energy in making Willowbrook a good place to live. Their concerns about property maintenance and civic participation weren't unreasonable. Their desire for neighbors who contributed to rather than detracted from community life wasn't malicious. The chain walker was taking those legitimate concerns and amplifying them, using them as justification for its supernatural enforcement activities. But the concerns themselves, the foundation it was building on, were real, which meant stopping it would require more than just refusing to participate. It would require figuring out how to address community standards and neighborhood belonging in ways that didn't exclude or intimidate anyone. Starting with getting 20 neighbors to leave the Morrison family's yard and go home. "Everyone needs to leave Mrs. Morrison's property," I said, using my community center voice, the one that got parents to clean up after birthday parties and teenagers to stop horsing around near the computers. "Right now, this gathering is over." "Nadia, you can't just dismiss community concerns," Silas started. I'm not dismissing them. I'm addressing them properly. I looked around at the faces of people I'd worked with for years, people whose concerns I understood even if I disagreed with their methods. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m. at the community center, we'll have a real meeting about neighborhood standards, property maintenance support, and how to welcome new residents properly, without supernatural harassment and without standing in anyone's yard uninvited. The chains rattled more violently, metal grinding against pavement in what sounded like frustration. Mrs. Chun stepped forward. But what about the chain walker? It's not going to stop just because we're having a meeting. Maybe not, but we can stop participating in what it wants us to do. I gestured toward Mrs. Morrison's house. This family doesn't deserve to be intimidated because they can't keep up with yard work. Half of us can't keep up with yard work either. We just hide it better or have more time on weekends. Kieran was nodding. Nadia's right. I've been so sleep-deprived this week, I forgot to put my garbage cans back for 3 days straight. That doesn't make me a bad neighbor. But community standards, Silas protested, can be maintained without supernatural enforcement, I said firmly. If we're concerned about property maintenance, we organize volunteer workdays. If we want better community integration, we plan inclusive social events. If we're worried about neighborhood safety, we improve lighting and communication. We don't gather in people's yards and make them feel unwelcome. Chloe looked uncomfortable. But the chains, what if they get worse? Then we deal with that too. But not by letting something from 90 years ago use our legitimate community concerns to harass families who are just trying to live their lives. Mrs. Morrison was still standing in her doorway, watching our discussion with the wariness of someone who'd been dealing with unwelcoming neighbors for months. Her children had appeared beside her, a boy about 10 and a girl maybe 7, both looking confused by the crowd of adults in their front yard. Mrs. Morrison, I called to her, would you and your family be interested in coming to the community meeting tomorrow night? We're going to talk about better ways to support all neighborhood families, including yours. She exchanged glances with her children, then looked back at me. Will it be more of this? More discussion about what we're doing wrong. It'll be discussion about what we can all do better, including those of us who've lived here longer. I glanced at Silas, Mrs. Chun, and the others. Community standards work both ways. Established residents have a responsibility to welcome newcomers, not just judge them. The chain sounds were moving now, backing away from the Morrison house and returning to the familiar patrol pattern. But there was something different about the rhythm, more agitated, less certain, like something that had been interrupted in the middle of its work. Slowly, the neighbors began dispersing. Silas lingered, clearly wanting to continue the discussion, but finally nodded and headed toward his car. Mrs. Chun patted my arm as she passed. You did the right thing, dear. Sometimes it takes someone from outside the old patterns to see them clearly. Kieran, Jude, and Chloe waited while I said goodbye to Mrs. Morrison and promised to call her with details about tomorrow's meeting. Think it'll work? Jude asked as we walked back toward the community center. Having a meeting about community standards while there's still a supernatural entity trying to enforce its own version? I think we have to try, because the alternative is letting the chain walker decide who belongs in our neighborhood based on criteria from 90 years ago. The chain sounds were still audible, moving through the residential streets in the familiar pattern. But they seemed more distant now, less insistent, like something that had lost some of its authority. What if people don't come tomorrow? Chloe asked. Then we'll have a small meeting, but we'll still have it. I looked back toward the Morrison house, where lights were on in the front windows and the family was presumably trying to have a normal Sunday evening. Because Mrs. Morrison and her children deserve neighbors who care more about helping than judging. Monday's meeting drew 38 people to the community center. Not everyone who'd been standing in the Morrison yard the night before, but more than I'd expected for a hastily organized discussion about community standards. Mrs. Morrison came, along with her husband and their 2 children. 3 other families who'd moved to the neighborhood within the past 2 years also attended, looking cautious but interested. I opened the meeting by acknowledging that Willowbrook had legitimate community standards worth maintaining: property upkeep, noise considerations, civic participation. But I also pointed out that those standards could be maintained through support and inclusion rather than criticism and exclusion. If we're concerned about yard maintenance, I said, we can organize volunteer workdays where neighbors help neighbors. If we want better community integration, we can plan events that actually welcome new residents instead of expecting them to figure out unspoken rules. If we're worried about property values, we can support all families in maintaining their homes instead of judging the ones who are struggling. The discussion that followed was sometimes awkward, sometimes tense, but ultimately productive. Mrs. Chun volunteered to organize a neighborhood welcome committee. Silas agreed to modify the neighborhood watch program to focus on safety rather than lifestyle monitoring. The Morrison family offered to host a backyard barbecue for families with children. By 9 p.m., we'd established concrete plans for monthly community workdays, quarterly social events, and a neighborhood resource sharing network for families dealing with work schedule or financial challenges. And for the first time in over a week, we didn't hear any chain sounds. Tuesday night, silence. Wednesday night, silence. Thursday and Friday brought October thunderstorms that would have masked any supernatural noises. But even after the weather cleared, the chains didn't return. By the following Monday, Mrs. Morrison's yard had been cleaned up by a group of volunteers led by Kieran and Jude. The neighborhood welcome committee had delivered information packets to all recent arrivals, including contact information for community resources and informal support networks. The chain walker legend was still part of Willowbrook history, but it wasn't part of our present. 3 weeks later, I was locking up the community center after a successful Halloween party when I heard footsteps behind me. Mrs. Morrison, carrying a covered dish and smiling. "Leftover pumpkin cookies from the party," she explained. "The kids insisted on making extras for the neighbors who helped with our yard work. That's very sweet of them. It's nice to feel like we actually have neighbors now instead of critics." She paused. "I still don't understand what happened that Sunday night. Why everyone suddenly decided our property maintenance was a community emergency." I could have told her about the chain walker, the historical incidents, the supernatural harassment that had used legitimate community concerns to justify intimidation and exclusion. But looking at her relaxed expression and hearing her children's laughter from the playground across the street, I decided some explanations weren't necessary. "Sometimes community standards get confused with community judgment," I said instead. "It takes conscious effort to maintain the standards while supporting the people." "Well, thank you for making that effort. It made all the difference." After she left, I stood outside the community center listening to the normal sounds of Willowbrook evening routine: dogs barking, cars starting, television programs through open windows. Familiar sounds that meant home and safety and belonging. No chain sounds. No supernatural enforcement of community standards. Just neighbors being neighborly, which turned out to be more powerful than 90 years of supernatural harassment. Though I still kept my ears open during October, just in case. Because community standards are ongoing work, and vigilance against exclusion requires constant attention. But the work was worth it, because everyone deserves neighbors who care more about helping than judging. Even if it takes a supernatural crisis to remember that.